welcome to 10 Rep Studio. In this video we will discuss painting landscape with fantasy colors without copying what we see in the reference photo. On my channel there are a lot of videos where I paint animals with rainbow colors. I will leave you a few links in the description below if you would like to check them out, but I was asking myself a question: can I do the same thing for landscapes? It was a bit of a process, I have to say. It took me a while to get there, but eventually I created this painting that we will discuss in this video. I started by painting on location. I was in Huntsville State Park here in Texas, and as you see, my sketch did not work out. I overworked it. If you squint when looking at it, you will see that the background is way too dark. So there really is no depth of space in the painting. And of course I took a reference photo, but again, it's useful only to a certain extent. This camera distorts tonal relationships. The advantage of doing all this was that when I started working on this painting in my studio on a larger format with watercolor, I already kind of knew what I shouldn't be doing. And I could remember my mistakes and I could remember the scene. And I was hoping that in the larger painting, I will make all the tonal relationships work and I will capture that sunlight, that depth of space, the air, and my painting will look realistic. I started, as you see, as we often do with watercolor painting, on a wet sheet of paper. I applied large washes with my big brush, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue. I used a lot of yellow for greens in the sunlight. That's another problem I encounter when painting outside. Sometimes humidity is fairly high, so the underpainting, especially if you start wet on wet, takes a long time to dry. Like I said, it's important, I think, to start outside, to do a sketch, to study the subject, the scene that you want to paint. But at least that's been my experience. I get much better results when painting in the studio. In terms of a finished painting, Layer 1 of free-flowing washes, working wet on wet, minimum details. I kind of started hinting at that big tree on the left side, some shadows, some texture on the water, and at some shapes in the background. There are those pine trees back there, but I was very careful not to make the same mistake and not to make them too dark and too detailed. It's very tempting to zoom into the photo, and the photo is such high quality, you can see every branch and every tree trunk, but if you're looking in reality with your own eyes, you don't really see all those details in the background. I'll let the first layer dry. I continued working by building up those tonal relationships, but carefully darkening certain areas with another layer of watercolor with slightly more intense color. I started adding details. There are some buildings. There is a dock and a few buildings on the other shore. I started adding shadows in the tree. There were some bare branches, but there are also some foliage kind of on the tree behind it. And I started painting those bare branches that add so much visual interest to the painting. I'm using Asian art brush because it's basically a calligraphy brush. It has a very pointy end, and it allows me to go very easily from thicker lines to very fine lines, which is very important when painting branches. You don't want them to be thick and heavy, and that can very easily happen if you're using a round brush, but it's not pointy. In terms of color, as you see, I'm sticking to what I see in the reference photo and also what I captured in my initial sketch. So cobalt blue, I mix it with lemon yellow to get green. And for the shadows, I am using Daniel Smith's Moonglow, which is a convenience pigment consisting of 3 pigments. It's ultramarine blue, anthraquinoid red, which is a cool red, gives you a purple, and then they added viridian green to it to neutralize the purple. So it's a cool purple, very interesting color. It kind of separates a little bit, as you see on my palette. So if you apply diluted, it can separate on watercolor paper, giving you interesting variations. It's good for shadows and for dark objects that are against light, like my branches. So instead of mixing some sort of a neutral purple, I just use this pigment. I don't use it very often, but I thought it would work for this painting because On a sunny day, the scene itself is usually fairly cool because the blue sky is reflecting in everything in sunlight, but the shadows need to be the opposite, so we need fairly warm color for the shadows, so not blue, but purple works really well. You don't want it vivid because we don't see vivid colors in shadows, so I wanted a neutralized purple. Another good brush to use for landscapes is of course the liner brush. Mine here is number 4. I do not like to use it for branches because branches are usually fairly long and this brush doesn't hold that much water. But for something like this, dry grasses or fine branches that trees have at the end of the big main branch, the liner brush works really well. It's flexible, so it's easy to paint with it fairly quickly. As you see, now I'm darkening all the shadows, I'm adding the details. So at this stage of the painting, liner brush can be very, very useful for landscape painting. When working in the studio, I also used my 3/8 of an inch dagger brush, that floppy brush that I have. It works great as well for branches. As you see in the reference photo, it's a lot of small branches, bushes, all kinds of dry grasses. It's basically a bramble that I have to paint. So of course I'm not going to paint every little branch and every little stem of grass. And that brush, which is also very, very pointy and flexible, helps me to create that mass of just thin little objects that to the viewer will hopefully look like wilderness, like natural environment. My last step was to adjust all the tonal relationships, to darken certain areas, darken the water that's in shadow, and of course I had to bring in some highlights, some reflected light into the foreground to add more details. You see I'm using white ink by itself and also in combination with blue and yellow to paint the details, again using the dagger brush. Dry brushing also works great for natural subjects like this, so balancing the tonal relationships. When I was sure that my painting is detailed enough and balanced enough, I added some more details on those distant buildings. I was so concentrated on them when I was painting the initial sketch that I overworked them, so I was determined in the studio painting not to overwork them, keep them very kind of general, keep them less detailed, like we would see them in reality if we were in that scene. Here is the studio painting. And then a few days later, I looked at it again and I was thinking, as a realistic painting, it's nice, but can I paint this scene without copying the colors that I see in the reference photo? I really like opera pink. I love yellows. I love mixing opera pink with yellows to get really nice orange colors. I love purples, which I have quite a selection of. I also have handmade purple right here, and I also have handmade watercolor. The pigment is called peach. I thought all this could make a really interesting landscape painting, but to tell you the truth, I had trouble just substituting all these colors in my head. I needed something to go by. And what I did, I opened a photo of my finished painting in Photoshop and I adjusted the color balance to the point where I liked the result, and I had all those pinks and purples and oranges. So this will be my reference for this next attempt. Another thing I wanted to change was the format of the painting. I felt horizontal format cuts off too much of the sky, so I switched to vertical format and I started painting with that new palette that I came up with. And another pigment I really wanted to use is Royal Blue by Senilia. It's right there in the middle on the bottom of my palette. It's a beautiful color, but I kind of rarely get to use it. It's semi-opaque. I have to be careful when using it, but I thought it will bring a lot of visual interest to this scene, and it will unite all those warmer colors that I have. That will be my cool color that will unite the whole scene. Also in this painting, I tried painting negatively around some of the branches. I only did a little section because it just takes so much time. But when I looked at the reference photo, I remembered that some of the branches actually looked, the sun was hitting them and they looked lighter than the background. So I wanted to try that. As we know, the sky is slightly darker on top when we look at it, and then it lightens towards the horizon because it's a curve. So I wanted those branches to be lighter on a darker background, and the only way in watercolor, not the only way, but one of the ways in watercolor that you can do that is to paint negatively. So I did that on top of my painting. I moved all those branches higher up, so I will have more sky, and I can kind of showcase my different shades of pink and orange and purple in the sky. And everything else, I basically proceeded in the same way as I did with the first painting. I paid special attention to tonal relationships. I kept the foreground more contrasting. The shadows are darker. There are highlights done with white ink. And there are a lot of details. As you see, I used splattering to show those fallen leaves that were everywhere on the ground, creating tiny little shadows. And I kept the background, the lake and the buildings in the background, and the forest much lighter and a lot less detailed. So even though I was using those fantasy colors, I wasn't copying the colors. You have to recreate the tonal relationships. Otherwise, the painting is not going to be realistic. It will flatten. It will look like an illustration, which can be beautiful too and is necessary sometimes. But since I wanted to create a realistic painting, I had to stick to those tonal relationships that I see in nature. I will show you both results in just a minute, so you can compare them and let me know in comments which one you prefer, the colors of nature or my fantasy colors. Also let me know what you think about this different format. I think it worked better for this scene in any case, making it vertical. And also let me know if you have any tips about using unrealistic colors in a realistic painting, how you go about figuring that out, figuring out a new palette. Do you just create a palette and paint with it? Do you use technology to help you out like I did? So here are the two paintings. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one here on Tamara Studios channel. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again and stay creative!